Hi, I'm Zala Fashant, and I'm joined today with my colleague, Linda Russell, who is one of the co-authors with Designing Effective Teaching and Significant Learning. So today we're going to be taking a look at the Online Course Design Institute review of Chapter 4, which is creating a learning framework. As you noticed before, it's part of the whole teaching strategy alignment that we covered in the OCDI 2 course. And today we're going to be really working and talking about the teaching and learning activities and breaking those down, taking a deeper dive in those. So Linda, why don't you get us started?
Thank you, Zala. I'm Linda Russell. Happy to be here with you today. When we talk about creating a learning environment, we need to consider some things. Some are universal things, how people generally learn, and some are very specific to individuals' unique styles. So let's start with that. Let's think about you. When you get a new device, a new watch, a new phone, a new computer, something electronic, how do you like to learn about it? So think about these 5 things. Do you play with it? Do you like to ask for help? Do you read the owner's manual? Do you go to YouTube and watch something? Do you watch a lecture from an expert? And just pause the recording for a moment and think, what's your favorite way to learn? Most of us have a preference. Most of us know right away, this is what I like to do. And in your case, maybe you didn't really think you would ask someone to give you a lecture on it. Maybe you like to play around with it. Maybe you're kind of a doer. We all have our own approaches to learning. And what's rather interesting is many times our own approaches to learning are very different than the kind of experiences that we have in our classes and in fact, the way that we teach. We also often find out as learners that we don't smoothly go from thing to thing, that we have gaps. We have some previous experience, but then we have a blank and we don't know quite how to bridge that gap. And when you have some experience with something, it is like you already have a place in your brain for that knowledge to go. And there you start. That's how you begin learning. You think about what do I already know? And how do I go from that to something that I don't already know? You might even get your own students thinking about what they already know about your particular course that you're working on and see what they prefer. How would they approach it? How would they think about it? What would they do? This is a nice quote that just illustrates that students do not just necessarily remember what they knew before. So significant learning really requires you, the teacher, to set up a framework for learning. And this is the universal part that I mentioned. Learning always moves from simple to complex. Every course you've ever taught, you know what do the students get right away and where are the bottlenecks, where are the things that always, every semester, no matter what you do, you run into some roadblocks for some students. And so this is really part of the disciplinary literacy of the course. Disciplinary literacy is basically in that discipline, how do you think? How do you talk? How do you write? How do you argue? What constitutes evidence? How do you organize ideas so that people can take them in? That's specific to a discipline. Those are not generic. They are very specific to each discipline. You know those because you're the expert in your discipline. It's possible that you remember what it was like to be a novice, but many times when you get to be an expert, you forget what it's like to be a novice, frankly, and you might make some leaps that your students aren't ready to make with you. And so you have to think hard and even ask your students to figure out where are those steps so that I can help my novice students get to the next level. It's difficult to remember those steps. Also, another factor in your being a teacher in a discipline is that you might have always been very strong in that discipline. You maybe always liked math, or you always really enjoyed science, or whatever it was. And that may even be why you went into a field. Therefore, when you like something, you practice it more because you enjoy it. You read about it, you talk about it. All those things strengthen your skill, deepen your understanding of it. It is possible that you struggled in some subject area, so think about that for a second. That's really what many of your students are doing. They may be taking your course, they're not necessarily majoring in it or going to go on in it, and they may have some struggles as novice learners, and they may have big gaps. And so if you can think about the fact that if you choose only one style or one particular activity to reinforce learning, you may be giving them an all or nothing situation. So that's difficult, because if that doesn't work for them, then they can't do it. So let's just try another think. Try this math problem. 17 plus 28 equals. Once you have the answer, and you can pause the recording here and choose an answer. And let's see what you chose. You might have chosen the way to think about it that you learned in elementary school. Maybe you regroup things, what we used to call borrowing and carrying. Maybe you reduce something to the nearest 10 and make it easy to do in your head. Maybe you have to write it down. Maybe you don't have to write it down. So you have developed a way to think about something, and you can think about doing it a different ways, a way that maybe you never thought about before. And that's what's an interesting thing. When somebody does run into a roadblock, could they think about it a different way? And could you think about it a different way, so that you match up with maybe how they're thinking about what their brain is going with that. In some areas, if you ask students to explain how they were thinking about it, you can get a sense of where their thinking is going. You might learn some new ways to do it as well. So 2 things to think about here. Are we interested in the answer? Are we interested in the process? Are we interested in both? Is it sometimes we're interested in the process and we care less about the answer? Is it other times the answer the most important thing? Those will vary according to what you're doing and when in the semester, perhaps it might change. But we do really want to think about both of those things with student learning. Sometimes people get the right answer for the wrong reasons. Sometimes people have all the process figured out and they do something goofy at the end and say something wrong or add it up wrong or make a computation error in mathematics. So the more that we think about this as a more holistic process, the more you're really tuning into where really are your students in this learning process. It's not just it's just not the thing at the end. So we have an elephant in the room. And every time we teach this course development, we talk about this particular elephant in the room. And that is, what do we do about lectures? We hear maybe lectures aren't okay. Are they okay? Aren't they okay? So of course, lectures are important. They do help students. They allow you to give students the information in perhaps a more interesting way with different examples than maybe your textbook. They help you engage with the students. Sometimes people mix in a lot of things with their lectures, like some brief discussion or question and answers. So lectures can be a valuable tool, definitely. However, lectures can also be a problem. Here are some tips that we know of to make your lectures more memorable, more engaging, and that reduce this thing that is known as the curse of knowledge, which comes from a book called Make It Stick. And that is, you know things that your students don't know, and so therefore you forget what they don't know. So you can't forget that you're the expert and they're not. So think about that. So reviewing background knowledge, which helps build that foundation, things, and remember that students forget what they learned in a previous course, so you can't depend on them knowing that. Chunking up the material so that there can be little mental breaks in between is extremely useful in learning. Doing formative assessments along the way, not a test, but just ways that you can maybe pop up on a screen a key question and see how your students are doing right then at that point, so that if you need to reteach something or they're making a classic mistake, you can catch it early. Not be in a rush, slowing things down. A lot of the feeling of drinking from a fire hose comes from courses where the emphasis is we've got to get through this curriculum, and so we're going to hurry up. Well, thinking takes time. Problem solving takes time. Learning new things does take time. So remember, the pacing and the speed is important. If you provide recorded lectures, that does allow students to listen to them again. And I think some people are a little worried about maybe students won't come to class and attend a live lecture or a live lecture online. But if you don't worry about that too much and think about it from the standpoint that somebody can review, can hear it again, that could really be useful for them. And it's very helpful for all students, but it might be significant for certain students. And visual aids and graphic organizers help students learn how to organize. This is part of your disciplinary literacy, because those kinds of ways of presenting material are specific to your discipline, and the students do not know that yet. So if you can help them with that, you're giving them a key way of thinking like you do. And then relating things to students' lives or careers is very significant, because students often do not like esoteric information that they can't understand how to apply. And so if you can help them think about the way that they might apply it, that would be good. And of course, in a lecture, be yourself. Are you funny? Be funny. Are you enthusiastic? Be enthusiastic. Those are significant. So with regard to teaching methods, if you think about what your experience has been in learning and how you maybe learn something best, you know, look at this pyramid here. This is an important thing, that at the very top, what this means is that when somebody is lectured at, they remember 5% of the information. And it gradually gets better, that retention of information. And as you get to the bottom, when you're actually actively trying to teach someone else something, then you really, really know it, and then you remember it longer. So you can see that as we start at the top and we go down, we're going from more passive, allowing students to be more passive, down to being completely active, 100% active. And if we can mix it up in our classes, you're going to have some of all of these things probably. But if all of your whole teaching is lecture, then students will not remember as much as if you can integrate some of the more participatory methods that get students more actively doing things rather than watching and listening. Because we always are asking students to do something at some point. They need practice with doing that. Now, this is an activity that I'm going to describe to you that I have used with my students for years. And it's a really good way to get things started in your class, to have students figure out, how does learning actually work for them? So for you, this is how it works. I ask students to think of something that they're really very good at, and that it needs to be something that they actually remember learning, and just what is it that they're super good at? And then I ask them to think of 3 things, and this is the first one. What is it like when you're first learning it? Now, what you get from students are a lot of affective words. They were maybe excited to learn it. Maybe they were afraid. Maybe they were terrified. Maybe they were embarrassed. Maybe they made a lot of mistakes. Maybe they were just so excited they couldn't keep it to themselves. All of those things are, almost all of those things are affective. But that's fine. We're just generating language, and we just want to see what it is. You can do this in an online environment by having them post these things in chat, for example. It works really well. So you see some commonalities, and everybody sort of has the same feelings when they're brand new at learning something. Now, the second part of learning, or the phase of learning, I guess, is when you start to gain some kind of competence. You're not super good at it yet, but you are gaining some skill. And that is where people go with this. They start saying things like, oh, I didn't make as many mistakes. Or I'm starting to feel kind of proud of myself. Or my coach said I was getting better, that type of thing. Or in a musical instrument, well, I wasn't screeching so much on my oboe. Those are things that start getting them to articulate, what does it mean to get that grasp of understanding something? You do get some affective stuff again, but a lot of it is more positive. Like, I started to feel proud. And they are noticing, you know, that they're good. Generally, somebody says something like, well, I'm getting better, but I really see how far I have to go. And those are good things to become talking about later on in the course when people struggle as well. You know, that happens. You still have a ways to go. And finally, what is it like now that you're really good at this thing that we ask you to describe? And I'm usually eager to point out that most of us do not become like master level skilled at everything we try. We often end up in that middle ground somewhere where we're okay enough to get along. But in this case, you're really good at it. And then they usually talk in very prideful terms. I'm so excited about this that I want to share it with others. I found that people ask me to help them, and I feel really good about that. I'm proud of myself for overcoming some difficulty, that type of thing. And it is really important that they see that they have come a long way. They understand they have a depth of knowledge, but they still sometimes say, but you're always learning. You're always learning. Now, the reason that I do this exercise with people is because it's a very hopeful model of learning. And it is, it basically means we all go through the same stuff. When we start stuff, we are all a little bit fearful maybe, or we're really kind of going to make a lot of mistakes, or we need a lot of help. And then we gradually get more skill and better, and we get a hold of things and we feel accomplished. And in fact, our brains really like to learn. It's a thing that our brain is made to enjoy. So we want to talk about that at the beginning of a course, so that when we run into trouble, what does it mean? Well, it means you're back at step one, maybe. Maybe you start a new thing in your course and it's a little bit confusing, or it's a little bit of a leap and everybody gets a little frustrated. That doesn't mean they're failing. That means all of a sudden they're not back at the novice level. And what do we need to do then? Well, we need to get help from somebody. We need to spend more time on it. We need to work on our errors, that type of thing. It's very non-judgmental. We all go through these things. And I have had students literally weep on the first day of class saying, no one has ever told me that I could learn, but now I feel maybe I can learn. It's very powerful. And it puts us all on the same plane. No matter who we are, this is how we learn. And so here's a short version that you can talk about after that. When we learn, we make mistakes. We use all of our senses. We need to practice a lot and make mistakes and practice again. And we need to get feedback on those mistakes before we get them too ingrained. We need to understand those disciplinary literacy skills. This is how we do it here. That's what they're like. We like to offer various sensory ways. We like to get enough practice, and you're the person who helps them figure out how much practice they might need. And we need to get to think like the experts think, argue, prove, value, write, and so forth. You're the curator. You're not the information fount. You're the curator. You're the one, and you can tell your students this. I'm the one who provides you with what I think are the best readings, the best presentations or essays or whatever it is. And I'm the one who provides you with the opportunity to practice in the best way. I try to set that up for you. However, it's the student's job to actually do it, because they're the brain that needs to be expanding and getting these ideas and understandings. And hopefully your projects, your problems selection, your things that you select for students to do are all designed to go with those learning outcomes so that they're moving in that direction. So my quick example is I had a math colleague who did a pie lab, understanding pie, and she selected a whole bunch of round lids of different sizes. So she curated that. Her activity was to just have the students do the actual thing, measure the outside of the circle of the round lid and across the diameter. And then she gave them problems, and the students discovered pi. They discovered the relationship between those two things was always around 3. Isn't that amazing? And so they had a more concrete understanding of an otherwise very abstract idea of 3.14 and all those other numbers that go after it. Significant learning. I think we're done. I'm sorry. When we think of significant learning today, we are thinking about what is out there in the world that will be hiring our students. And the employers tell us these things. They want students that can work as part of a team. They have to be able to do critical thinking. They have to be able to collaborate. They have to include people. They have to understand about being inclusive. They have to work on solutions, problem solving. Their communication skills need to be good, and they have to be able to handle the technology for the position that they're in. Notice that none of those have anything to do with content. Here's a nice little graph that tells you what are the ratings of new graduates. So students rate themselves a proficient or not, and employers rate themselves or the same students. And well, they agree that these things are important, but actually the employers are not seeing as much of the skills in some of these areas. But look at equity and inclusion, look at teamwork, look at technology. So you can see that those are better. Those are, students are coming out having much more experience in those kinds of things, but we still have work to do in getting students to match up a little bit better with the expectations that's out there in the workforce. So course design here emphasizes these things. Having students uncover the content versus teachers covering it. And that Pi Lab example is an example of that, where you can't have students experiment all the time. It takes a long time, but you can emphasize certain important concepts. I have to go back to this. We are looking for deeper learning. We're looking for chunking and then applying using short active learning things. This keeps students engaged. The information age is such that there's not any way that we can all keep everything in our heads. So what we need people to know how to do is find information rather than memorize all of it. There's an element of memorization to most things, but it just doesn't stop there. So knowing how to use sources, using critical thinking to recognize credible and trustworthy sources, those are really important. And within your discipline, again, those are discipline specific. So it is part of your job to help students get there. They can't just take an information literacy course and know all of it from your discipline's point of view. We like to see low stakes activities because that engages students more and they're not too worried about how this is going to affect their grades. And then you build to those longer or bigger, higher stakes activities, which might include a big project or a capstone project or a presentation. It might include exams or finals, that kind of thing. But it's good to have some examples that are very similar to that capstone or that final to practice with in chunks and small chunks so that they know what to expect. We do want to encourage the use of prior knowledge and experiences. And even when students are rank amateurs at something in your discipline, they've been walking and talking all these years. They know things, and they know things that are tangential, but maybe can be shown the bridge to the things that you're trying to do. And so they're not blank slates, that's for sure. We want to practice with team-based learning whenever we can because it's used so much in the workforce. And then effortful retrieval is a concept about studying and learning, which goes like this. You can look at something and memorize it, and you can read something over a lot of times, but the best way to get it in your head is to try to remember it and explain it without looking back, without looking at what your notes say or what your book says, because then that way you find out really fast what you know and what you don't know. And then you can spend your time on what you couldn't remember or what you couldn't explain clearly. Creating learning frameworks with these different learning types. So there are different ways to get students to do things, and some of our activities are kind of passive, and some of our activities are really active, and some of them allow students to connect ideas, and some of them allow students to reflect on things. All of them are necessary, and we can mix them up, and here's an example of some of each. Reading is quite passive because it's one way. It isn't bad, it's just more passive. When you ask students to react to things, that is active, and it can also be reflective depending on the kind of question that you ask them. Reflective activities gets them to think about themselves in relation to the concept. What might I do with this? Why could this be important for me? What do I need to do differently? Retaining is a connective activity in that you connect different ideas so that you can put them together and that you remember them together. Retaining is huge, particularly when you're asking students to show what they know. Retrieval is also really important because you can retain it, but if you can't pull it back out again to talk about it or write about it or produce something, that's the thing. And in so many cases, that's what we have to do. It uses effortful retrieval, and it promotes that deeper learning. And it's better, again, if they're not just regurgitating something, but they have to connect some ideas together and then also explain them. This table is something that we like to use because it puts a lot of information in front of you at one time. If you look at the center column where it says assessments and learning activities, those are examples of things a person could do. And in the second column, or the column to the right of that, learning types, you see how we have labeled them, what we have labeled. And so what you're trying to do in your class is to have a mix. So you can have some activities that are all of those things at different times. In our world today, there's a lot of efforts in diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives in college. We have many campuses that are highly diverse. Where I taught, we had students from all over the world. We always like to say we had 80 languages spoken on our campus. And we had a lot of American diversity as well. Black students, Native American students, affluent students, not affluent students, you know, all kinds of diversity. And so we start to think about all the learning is not the same for every person. Not everybody relates to material the same way and that kind of thing. And so it's just about being understanding about who is your audience and what might their experience base be, and to be inclusive in the scope of your curriculum. The content actually could be inclusive, maybe more than it is. You have to examine that yourself. And also the methods of learning and the methods of showing what you know and that sort of a thing. It isn't that you have to change everything about your course, but being aware of some of those things and realizing they have value, they bring value to your discipline, they bring value to your classroom. It will help your students feel more connected to what you're doing. So this is an example that Zala wrote, I think, and it is an example of understanding the study of astronomy and physics that he says, I learned about the dead white Europeans who made important discoveries like Kepler, Copernicus, Newton, Da Vinci, Galileo, and Einstein. And that made sense. However, when he started to teach 5th grade, he started more thinking about other cultures. I personally had a student like that who was from Central America, and her ethnic background, you know, included people who had studied the universe or studied at least the sky and understood a lot about the way things worked. And she was really put off by her astronomy class. And she was able to use the opportunity of writing a paper in the course to explore more what her own culture brought to the picture. But it would have been nice if in the course itself, it acknowledged the contributions of more diverse groups. It's not hard to do that. And it would have helped her feel more connected to the course right away. So some questions. If I were Black, if I were Asian, Native American, am I included here? What if I'm a female? Am I included here? What if I'm a white male who wants to learn more and understand the world more deeply? Those are important things to think about. And I know I can say as a white person, there are things I did not learn about American Black history because they were not in my books. And they were not in my curriculums that I was in. And I met students at my college who knew much more about that than I did. And it caused me to feel like I missed something. And I'd like to know, it would help me understand our country and politics and all kinds of things more deeply if I understood them. So how about you? What have you provided students with a wide variety of backgrounds? How have you figured out ways to engage them, maybe help them feel more motivated? Do students get any credit for expanding their learning to include others, or is there any opportunity for them to explore that? How are you getting students to think more broadly? It does not mean that you have to add 2 more weeks of work into your curriculum. That doesn't work. You're already busy and you already have a busy curriculum and a full schedule. It does mean more about integrating this as just a natural thing. It could be that you have to spend less time on something in order to put that in, but it isn't too hard to infuse this and to make it a part of your course that you are thinking more broadly all the time. And now another aspect of learning is, again, thinking about your learner in a different way. We have some psychologically prevalent traits, and one of them is a continuum of extroversion and introversion. Carl Jung popularized this theory of types, and then two women, Briggs and Myers, developed this Myers-Briggs personality type indicator. You don't necessarily need to go out and do the Myers-Briggs test or anything. It includes more than this, but the introvert-extrovert range does come into play in our classes. Generally speaking, extroverts like to interact with others, and they gain energy from interacting with others. They almost take energy out of that experience, and it gets them really engaged. Introverts tend to gain energy by reflecting internally rather than, in fact, they can actually feel like being with others is tiring. So how are you in this scale? Where are you in the scale? And nobody's a perfect type, so you're maybe on a continuum. So how would you answer this question? In general, when attending a large event, do you feel energized and ready for more? Or are you tired and drained even if you had fun? You probably know how you feel if you go somewhere and it's busy and you get home and you feel like hiding in a closet or sticking your pillow over your head. And you also know if you go to a place and when it's time to go, you're all revved up and, you know, had a great time and ready to go and you're not drained. So these are characteristics we walk around with. You can tell pretty fast how to describe somebody. The extroverts like to think out loud a lot of times. And so in a classroom, those are the students who are popping up with things and discussing and taking the topic and making it bigger or going down a different path. Maybe it's a little hard to rein them in sometimes. They're going to be the people who like class discussion. They like getting together in a group. They like working with a partner or something like that. And they seem like the most active and engaged people in your class. That is deceptive. That is very deceptive. Introverts are often more to themselves. They don't really want to have to express their ideas unless they've had time to think about them. So having a split second where you're asking questions of a class and expecting people to just pop out with things, that could be more stressful to them because they haven't had time to actually reflect on it first. They don't want to talk their way to a point, they want to have a point. Sometimes they're quiet, sometimes they're working by themselves, not necessarily all the time, but they will really opt out of the group and work on something and then maybe come back and say, okay, this is what I contributed to the group because I can do my work alone. So think about a work environment even. I mean, you have to give people some time in order for them to do their best thinking. And if you don't, then they may not succeed in the same way that they could if they had that. Even in the workplace, some workplaces are designed for extroverts to be very successful or considered very successful, and introverts are sort of cast to the side, like maybe they're not participating very much, and that's a problem. Introverts will assess more through reflection, revealing really important ways to advance collaborative team thinking, but they may not be ready to share those ideas as instantly as an extrovert. So faculty are also introverted or extroverted as we are, and we tend to design courses that would appeal to us ourselves. And so introverted faculty like to design courses with a more internalized approach. They may not ask students to participate right in class on the spot because they know they wouldn't like it very well. They also may not feel that comfortable managing the actual classroom dynamics of live discussion and things like that. Extroverted faculty tend to really move toward interaction of students They do gravitate toward having discussions. Maybe they think it makes the class more exciting and so forth. And it does for certain students. So if you think about yourself, think about the other person, your alter ego, so that you can imagine what somebody would feel like if they didn't want to speak right away. So for example, one thing you might do is pose a question when students are coming to class and let them take a few minutes, and introverts can jot down their thoughts and then they'll be ready to say something. Extroverts may not, they might look at the question, but they may not need to feel that they have to organize their ideas that way. So I said a couple of these ideas on here, but it is really, there's a bias to extroversion. If you can't express yourself in a meeting, let's say, you may not be deemed as successful as someone else. And so we want to give students practice in learning how to do that well, even within their own comfort zone. They really are a significant part of our population. So we want to give them tools to say, and you can speak to this even in class. If if you like to reflect on your ideas before you speak, here are a couple tips that you can do. You can, I'll post some questions online ahead of time, and you can think about them so you're being prepared to talk about them in class, and that will guide them. An extroverted student may not feel the need to have that prompt at the beginning, but it really would give somebody some time to think, and then they'll be more successful. And you'll learn what they're thinking. You'll understand where they're coming from. If you never hear from them, you don't know. So here we're looking at providing some flexibility. If you give students tools, then they can function in a lot of environments. Some extroverted students never shut up, to be honest, and they need to learn to listen. They need to learn to give people some time. And you can build that into your class too, even if you do post something out right now in live. You can say, all right, take 30 seconds and just think about that. Don't say anything yet. Because you know that the extroverted students are instantly going to be popping up with ideas, even if they're kind of random, and your introverts are going to be feeling stressed. And that's not the point. The point is to get students thinking about what you ask them and then give them time to maybe they first discuss it with a partner for 2 minutes before they're ready to talk about it in front of a whole group. That gives the introverted student a tool. Okay, I just need a little time. And it gives the extroverted student some coaching about how it's important to wait so that other people get a chance to offer their ideas before you explain everything, and then they can have an easy out. They can be passive if they want to. So it's helpful to see what we're trying to get students to do so they can succeed in either of these conditions. So we've done some thinking about how you design courses with this particular thing in mind. And so you can take time, pause, and take a look at this. There are numbers of things that work really well for both types if they're tweaked just a little bit. Everybody needs to learn something about the other sort of type. And like I just said, you need to give everybody the tools to do that. So take a look at this when you have the time. So we want our balance. We want something that will give something to all of our students and allow them all to thrive. And then you get to think about your own course in terms of this. Who are you appealing to the most? And if you're leaving out one side or the other, what is it that you might do? And this is just a quote from one of our participants. Uncovering the content is a very different kind of approach than most of us are accustomed to. We are mostly accustomed to being the knowledgeable person who is transmitting the information. So turning that around a little bit is definitely a new approach. This is a slightly different topic here, and that is pacing. Pacing in teaching will help the students, certainly, but they will also help you so you don't get overloaded. We talk about some things here about just making your due dates of all the courses that you teach. Not everything is due in the same day, so you don't have to look at everything at once or feel overloaded. It also helps students. I do know that when online learning started, an awful lot of people had everything due on Sunday night at midnight. I don't know why that was, but can you imagine being a student who's taking 4 or 5 classes and every single thing is due? That makes your weekend a nightmare because probably nobody starts working on that until later in the week. So it is important to think about the realities of that. Consider late work. How important is it for students to do the work even if it's late? So you want students to complete the work. If they get nothing, if it's late, if it's 5 minutes later, if it's 3 days late, then they're not going to do it. So does that work? I mean, then that means they're not doing the work that you think is valuable that will help them learn. Because remember, you're trying to get them to practice things that will help them get better. So sometimes in schools, I think we get very rigid. Everybody else have ways to deal with late that are not so punitive. It's not just like, that's it, one thing. You can lower the grade for late work if that is important. That will affect them, but not so deeply. And you kind of have to think about how much do you want that to matter without being completely lax. So I obviously don't have an absolute answer because we're just working with human beings here, but just think about the rigidity versus a little bit of grace that you can give people. And during COVID, I think that is one of the things that a lot of instructors did feel, that they got more compassionate because everybody was going through a hard time. And that maybe it didn't make that much difference in the long run, but it made people feel better. So consider that. Also, thinking about due dates for high stakes assignments and things that often happen at the end of the semester. If you can give yourself a little bit of time afterward, that also allows for some disaster that occurs to someone at the end and, they can't do the final exam and it's not the end of the semester yet. If you can do something where we still have a little bit of time left, a couple things happen. One is that the students get feedback about their performance, and it's kind of late. So that's good to get that feedback at the end of the semester. And they may have even look at the feedback if there's still time left. And sometimes students don't get any feedback for a final project or a final exam if it's at the very end. You could have them reflect on that assignment later at the end. So that's one way to handle that. But just thinking about how is this activity, what kind of pressure do we put on people all at the very end of the semester, and what kind of pressure do you have at the end of the semester to get through and get your grades in and so forth. It all doesn't have to be compressed into the last possible minute. So think about how you might spread that out or make it multiple smaller activities. And also determining how the activities lead to the culmination of what you consider to be mastery of the course objectives and learning outcomes. You have to be, looking at your activities throughout. Every activity takes a little bit of time. How should I coordinate them? How do they work together? So that ultimately they're putting together all of these activities in some meaningful way that works for your discipline or your program. What will work, and also working with other people or individually. Can you have a mix of that? So just when you're thinking about pacing, if you are shifting from a mostly lecture to looking at more activities take time in a different way than lecture does. And so determining that you don't have to make all the changes at once, you'll start to get a sense of what you really want to spend your time on that really leads to the results that you want. So here, when we go on to the next part, we'll be thinking about learning activities and creating opportunities for various types of learners. And remember that you're the curator. You're not the fount of knowledge. Thank you for coming today. We appreciate that you are here, and we hope to have you enjoy the next chapter as well.